Coming up on Now It's History.
Up on the 36th floor of the International Building at Rockefeller Center, the largest foreign spy operation in U.S. history was taking place in that building. Cynthia's job was basically to intimately get involved with diplomats so that she could compromise them sexually. In the middle of the night, they broke into the Japanese offices. They took papers out, cipher papers, quickly made copies of them, and then they put them back. Japanese were none the wiser. A propaganda campaign that they ran through this spy agency trying to influence American opinion.
And in the middle of it all is the invisible spy, a former college football star and NFL player who develops the key personal relationships behind one of the most far-reaching intelligence operations of World War II, including a close friendship with the creator of James Bond. Welcome to Now It's History. I'm your host, Richard Gallant. We're on a journey to explore the dividing line between the present and the past, to help make sense of the tumultuous times we're living through right now. I'm delighted that my guest today is Thomas Mayer, the author of a fascinating new book. It's called The Invisible Spy, Churchill's Rockefeller Center Spy Ring, and America's First Secret Agent of World War II. Tom and I worked together years ago at Newsday, where he was a first-rate investigative reporter. While Tom was breaking award-winning stories at Newsday, he was also beginning to write the first few of his 7 books. They cover topics as varied as the Kennedy and Newhouse families, Dr. Benjamin Spock, the sex experts Masters and Johnson, and the ties between mafia bosses and the CIA in the 1960s. Tom's career took on a new dimension when Showtime turned his Masters and Johnson book into the widely praised series Masters of Sex. And last year, he registered another success with Paramount and Showtime's docuseries Mafia Spies, based on Tom's book. Tom, welcome to Now It's History.
Rich, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. Well, your book seems perfectly designed to catch my interest, since I'm a fan of Churchill and Roosevelt, James Bond, and his creator, Ian Fleming. And you shed much new light on the activities of British officials in New York who were determined to enlist America to their cause of fighting Nazi Germany. I'm curious, what led you to this story?
A couple of different things. One is, as you had mentioned, I had done a book about Churchill's and the Kennedys, and there was an allusion to the spies at Rockefeller Center that Churchill had put in place as soon as he became prime minister in May of 1940. Bear in mind, at that time, England was already at war. London was being bombed, and Churchill came to the conclusion that he absolutely had to have America involved in the war. Otherwise, he would lose to Hitler. So by putting the spies on the 36th floor of Rockefeller Center, they were doing 3 things. They were keeping an eye on the Nazis and the isolationists in the United States. They were trying to make sure that the supply lines to England were kept open. That was extremely important as well. But the number one thing that they wanted to do was have essentially a disinformation or a propaganda campaign that they ran through this spy agency trying to influence American opinion. And so that was one of the major reasons for it. I also became aware of Ernest Cuneo, and he's one of those people that by today's jargon, we call it a deep state figure. But Cuneo was a man who not only was an NFL football player and had been a trained lawyer, but he was involved in Roosevelt's political campaign. So he was involved that way. He was involved in the media. He was the legal counsel for Walter Winchell, who was, it's almost hard to imagine by today's standards, but Walter Winchell was a huge voice in the American media. He had a Sunday night program. He had a column that appeared in many, many newspapers around the country. And the other client of his was Drew Pearson, who Cuneo represented. And so together, Cuneo had an outsized impact on American media. And thirdly, he got involved increasingly with the world of espionage, with the Office of Strategic Services. He was the liaison for that spy agency, which was America's first spy agency. It was Cuneo's job to deal with the Brits at Rockefeller Center, but also the State Department, the Justice Department, the FBI. So he was really a deep state figure or a political fixer, but he was a fascinating character. And I realized it would be really challenging to write his book. The thing that kind of gave me pause was that he was deliberately anonymous. He realized that the key to his power, his influence, was by remaining in the backdrop. So I knew that would be a problem. The other thing, as you mentioned, the other books that I have written have been about well-known great men theory of history. The idea that writing about JFK or writing about Churchill or whoever, that you have to write about a well-known figure. And so it gave me pause about whether or not to pursue this project, because my guy, Cuneo, was deliberately trying to remain anonymous.
You explain in the book that there was a kind of sequence of events that led him to want to be anonymous. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting because initially he sought fame. As I mentioned, he became an NFL football player. He was an Italian-American kid from New Jersey who went to Columbia, and he was a star football player and a wrestler at Columbia. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, not the baseball team, but the very early NFL franchise. And he played for 2 years. And so he did seek the limelight initially. At one point, he got hurt, and his father, who was an Italian-American immigrant to this country, basically said, you're chasing the bright, shiny lights. And he kind of dressed him down for that. But I think over time, Cuneo realized that he was better at being behind the scenes, being an influencer, being a counsel, a lawyer for all these various powerful people. I think there was also a restriction 100 years ago in this country, and that's what we're talking about in the 30s and the 40s, of Italian Americans. Italian Americans, generally speaking, were not in really high positions. So I think that was also part of the restriction that he felt. So he realized by being anonymous, and he actually says that in his unpublished memoir, by being anonymous, it was the key to his power.
One of the interesting sidelights is that he was a player in the whole effort to get the American public to accept FDR running for an unprecedented third term.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a thing called the Brains Trust, a group of predominantly New Yorkers who went to the White House and served under President Roosevelt, particularly in the 1930s, when Roosevelt, during the Depression, was putting in his New Deal policies, which were primarily domestic policies. And Cuneo was part of that. And by 1940, it was a key moment because no other president had ever run for a third term. Roosevelt was still certainly by today's standards, a relatively young man. He was in his late 50s. And so they decided, particularly with the prospect of things occurring in Europe and that it looked like we would have to go to war, that it was best that FDR run for a third term. Cuneo was involved in this campaign. One of the major things that he did was help plant uh, encouragement for a third term, the idea of a third term in Walter Winchell's columns and on his radio show. And so by the fact that the president of the United States was thinking of getting involved, it kind of dissuaded other Democrats from jumping into the 1940 race. And then eventually that's exactly what happened, that FDR did run for a third term, and he was there to oversee the American operations during World War II.
So many Americans know Rockefeller Center as the home of the famous Christmas tree and the skating rink, but something else was going on there during the early years of World War II.
Sure was. It really appealed to me with this book as a person who has had a lot of really good things happen to. Rockefeller Center has always had a special place in my heart. It's the place where I actually proposed to my wife many moons ago. Underneath that tree, that Christmas tree, I was working in Chicago, and I flew home and I proposed to my wife there, and a number of other things. Rockefeller Center has always been, to me, a place of fascination. But the idea that up on the 36th floor of the International Building at Rockefeller Center is the building that has the Atlas sculpture in front of it. It's right. It faces St. Patrick's Cathedral. The idea that a whole group, the largest foreign spy operation in U.S. history, was taking place in that building. I had no idea about that as a native New Yorker. So that was a big part of the intrigue. And also, I guess I do have an eye for what would make a good TV show. And I thought that I just have always liked Rockefeller Center with its Art Deco, and just as a setting, I thought it was fascinating. The fact that Cuneo finds a woman who is a Churchill spy who he falls in love with at Rockefeller Center is also part of that romance of the story.
Great. So let's take a little step back and talk about the formation of the British operation at Rockefeller Center.
Well, the Churchill operation at Rockefeller Center was a combination of both British spies and Canadian spies. It was run by a man by the name of William. His code name, or his nickname among his peers, was Intrepid. It's William Stevenson, aka Intrepid, and he oversaw this operation. He had been a kind of a hero in World War I. He was a very successful businessman, and he had been a source for Churchill leading up to World War II. And so it was Stevenson who was put in charge of all of this. And eventually, as many as 1,000 people worked in this operation at Rockefeller Center. And he was a person that put together this agency. He also was the one who reached out to J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the head of the FBI. And Hoover said, I can't give you permission to run a foreign spy operation here in the United States, but if you get the permission of the president, I'm good with it. And one of the people that they knew, that mutually knew of, was Ernest Cuneo. Cuneo working with the administration, the Roosevelt administration, and it was Cuneo who went to the president and got the permission for Stevenson to set up this operation. And it was Cuneo's task to be the liaison, to be the one who would be the intermediary between the British and the White House. And this is at the same time that FDR in 1940 was campaigning, saying, "I will not send your children to war." Most of America was isolationist at the time. World War I was only 20 years earlier. They didn't want to get involved in a foreign war over in Europe, most Americans. And so there was a real effort to try to convince Americans that we had to get involved in this war and stop Hitler.
And the BSC, the British operation based at Rockefeller Center skated pretty close to the line and maybe even over it in some of their propaganda and intelligence work.
Well, in doing this book, Ernest Cuneo died in the 1980s. So one of the great helps of this book was getting the cooperation of his son, Jonathan Cuneo, and his daughter, Sandra Cuneo, both of whom were prominent attorneys. And Jonathan died about 2 years ago. In fact, I dedicate the book to Jonathan. Jonathan, in particular, was a great help to me, and he provided a memoir that was never published that his father had written. And there were a number of papers that were also donated by Cuneo's family to the FDR Library, the Presidential Library up in Hyde Park, New York. It was from those sources that much of this book is based.
Talking about some of the things the BSC did, they were involved in sort of concocting some polling that was uh, fabricated.
Yeah, I mean, it's really pretty brazen. In fact, Cuneo's son, Jonathan Cuneo, a lawyer himself, said to me, if it had been found out what his father was doing on behalf of President Roosevelt, that Roosevelt could very well have been impeached. It was that brazen. But one of many things that Cuneo did with the British was to hire a pollster. His name was Sanford Griffith, and the exchanges between this pollster and Cuneo are contained in Cuneo's papers. So as I put it together, what was clear was that they were doing surveys. They were getting involved in congressional campaigns, essentially trying to stop isolationist Congress people from being reelected. So that was pretty extraordinary. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting, they ran a survey of the delegates to both the Republican and the Democratic conventions in 1940. And what the survey found was that most delegates to both conventions favored intervention in the European war. They favored getting involved in the fight against Hitler, which was obviously the British view, which was their hope. But the reality was that most Congress people, the letters that they were getting sent to their offices were very much against the idea of getting involved. And yet that survey was published. It was also publicized by Cuneo and by people like Winchell and others, and they got it out there. It also appeared in newspapers like the New York Times and the Herald Tribune and a number of other papers with stories that said that delegates to both presidential campaigns favor getting involved in the war, when in fact they didn't. It was all staged by the British with the help of Cuneo.
And then how did things change after December 7th, 1941?
Well, with Pearl Harbor, they changed a lot. It was, first of all, America declared war very quickly, not only on Japan, but joined the British. By Christmas of that year, Churchill came over and spent that holidays with FDR, essentially planning the European campaign. And so a lot of things changed within 1 month. And as far as Cuneo was concerned, the effort that he was doing was essentially codified into an agency called the Office of Strategic Services. A man that he had been working with, a guy named William Wild Bill Donovan, who had been a military man, a decorated serviceman, was put in charge of the OSS. And it was Cuneo's job to be the liaison, the official liaison with various different agencies, the British, but also with the State Department, with the FBI, and with other agencies and outside people, the media, Congress people, because Cuneo by that point was so well connected that he was very good at enacting things that William Donovan was not particularly good at. And so that was the major change for Cuneo with the declaration of the war.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the tactics that were used by the Rockefeller Center spies, the recruitment of Cynthia, the um, Japanese code breaking, and some of the other fascinating incidents.
Well, yeah, there's a number of women who were recruited to become part of these Churchill spies. Many of these women were Canadian. One of the Canadian women was Margaret Watson, who Cuneo meets and eventually marries at the end of the war. But there was another woman who was recruited, and her code name was Cynthia. And there was a handler, a woman who worked at Rockefeller Center who oversaw what was going on with Cynthia. Cynthia's job was basically to uh, uh, intimately get involved with various different diplomats so that she could compromise them sexually and get various different secrets. And she was quite effective. She was quite devoted to her task. And she had a great degree of success. And that was very fascinating to me. They actually did the same thing with the future novelist Roald Dahl, a British aviator who got injured and wound up working for the British spies. And in Washington, he had affairs with various different women, kind of the same way of trying to influence things sexually. So I thought that was, needless to say, pretty fascinating. I also thought the dynamic of the women working at Rockefeller Center there was, I tried to put as much together about that aspect of the story as I possibly could.
And then there was the incident that was, I guess, the basis for a James Bond novel at the Japanese consulate.
Well, one of the major characters in my book is Ian Fleming, a British spy, very creative. He worked with the British Naval Intelligence, but he also worked with the British Security Cooperative. That was the name of the British spies. That was their formal name. And Ian Fleming worked with Cuneo at Rockefeller Center there. One of the things that Fleming later recreated in his James Bond book was a real incident that happened while he was working at Rockefeller Center with Bill Stevenson, the head of the Churchill spies there. What they decided one night to do around 3:00 in the morning was to break into the Japanese. They had some type of consul office in Rockefeller Center itself. A number of countries had offices at Rockefeller Center. But in the middle of the night, they broke into the Japanese offices and they opened up the safe. They had a safe cracker who knew how to do that. And they took papers out, cipher papers that essentially were able to help decipher messages by the Japanese. And they got these papers and they went upstairs to their offices. They quickly made copies of them and then they put them back into the safe of the Japanese office. And it was all kind of an undercover operation that was successful, that apparently the Japanese were none the wiser about what had happened. And it was Fleming who later on in his James Bond book kind of upped the ante on this story. And so it was essentially the same type of situation. But in the James Bond book, Bond actually from a distance takes a rifle shot at a Japanese cipher expert and assassinates him, shoots him through a window at Rockefeller Center. So that was in the first book, Casino Royale, that Fleming wrote. The thing about this, that stepping back and looking at this, was not only did Cuneo and Fleming become very good friends and later business partners during World War II, but there was a desire by a lot of these folks afterwards to try to relay the most exciting experiences of their life. The Bond books represent Ian Fleming's way of taking his own experiences and incorporating them into the James Bond books. In fact, he would say that Bill Stevenson was a kind of a prototype for James Bond, and he also used other aspects of it. But the whole aura of being a secret agent really begins at Rockefeller Center with Ian Fleming's experiences with Ernest Cuneo.
You mentioned before Cuneo's Italian-American identity and heritage. Of course, famously, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. interned tens of thousands of Japanese Americans in what is now considered a really shameful aspect of U.S. history. But there were efforts also to take action against Italian Americans. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as you say, we are very well aware of the thousands of Japanese Americans who were interned, and it was the most, it was the biggest stain on Roosevelt's presidency, his handling of that war, which was overall magnificent, but this was terrible. Cuneo got wind of that this would also extend this effort to intern quote unquote foreigners in this country, recent immigrants, that it would extend to the Italian American community. And not only would it extend to the Italian American community, but it could conceivably affect his parents and members of his family and friends. And so when he found out about it, he made a big effort. He went to some top people in the Roosevelt administration and protested about it. And he was very successful in mitigating that. There was definitely a big difference of opinion within the Roosevelt administration about interning Italian Americans, but that overall effort, Cuneo was able to dissuade and change the policy that way.
So now let's move on a little bit to the period after Hitler is defeated and Japan is defeated. The Soviet Union turns from ally to adversary of the United States, and new information starts surfacing about Soviet espionage.
Yeah, initially it was through defectors. So as you mentioned, towards the end of the war, we had even then we had a very interesting relationship, a conflicted relationship with the Russians. It was the Russians who did a lot of the heavy lifting in World War II. They were the ones who incurred a lot of casualties in the fight against Hitler. And that was part of it. So they were our allies during World War II. But even during the war, and certainly towards the end of the war, it was clear that the dividing lines would change and that it would be the allies of the Brits and the United States, the free world, essentially. And on the other side, it would be the Russians, the Soviet Union, the communists. They would try to have their own sphere of influence, their own empire. It became clear through defectors that there had been double agents placed in both among the spies at Rockefeller Center, but also within the OSS, the first American spy agency, that there had been double agents, Russian double agents put in there. It was defectors who provided the information. In other words, people who were double agents, and they said, I don't want to be in the world with the Russians anymore. I'm going to confess. And there were two particular cases, one in Canada and one here in the United States. It was very revealing because I think it shook up a lot of American policymakers. There were a lot of people, particularly in the liberal community, particularly people within the Roosevelt administration, who were open to the whole idea of being allies with the Russians, whose own socialist bent kind of was favorable, looked favorably to what the Russians had been doing under communism. And Stalin, the excesses and the abuses of Stalin were kind of wallpapered over during the war. We didn't quite understand all of the excesses. By excesses, I mean mass killings in places like the Ukraine that Stalin was responsible for. So I think there was kind of a division within the Roosevelt administration. You can see it through Cuneo's eyes as well. Cuneo was much more of a progressive left-wing person, not a liberal. That's exactly what he was. He was not a leftist, but he was definitely more sympathetic during the 30s. But through the experience of World War II, by observing what the Russians were doing, you can see through Cuneo's eyes that he realizes that the Russians are no longer our ally, but actually are a security threat to this country. And so that's a big turning point in our foreign policy right after the war. It's really the beginning of the Cold War. And one last person the most preeminent spokesman of warning about the Cold War was Winston Churchill himself.
The death of FDR in 1945, Cuneo lost his most powerful political backer. How did he continue to be relevant and effective in politics then?
Well, to some extent, he lost, as you say, a great deal of his power towards the end of his life. He had actually been overseeing a poll of the 1944 election, which FDR winds up winning. But he goes to the White House. This is a scene in my book, and it's a one-on-one conversation with the president, and he tells him about the survey. But when Cuneo sees FDR, who's now dying of congestive heart failure, he's shocked by the way FDR looks. It's almost, as he said, had a death mask on his face, that he looked so sickly. This was clearly a man who was going to die. After Roosevelt dies, Truman comes in as the vice president. And shortly after World War II, Truman ends the OSS. He closes down the agency. And about 2 years later, Truman realizes, no, I really do need a spy agency. And thus the CIA was born. But the way that Cuneo kept his influence in government was that he was still actively involved with Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson in terms of the media. He essentially was what was known as an asset. He became a person of influence. He was he knew Allen Dulles, the new head of the CIA, fairly well. Dulles had worked at Rockefeller Center early during World War II, and he had worked on something with Cuneo. So they knew one another. So Cuneo maintained that influence. The other thing that he did was he created a company, or he bought a company, called North American Newspaper Alliance. And actually his pal, Ian Fleming, would be the head of the London office for NANA, the North American Newspaper Alliance. And it was both a newspaper a provider of syndicated columns and reporting and such, but it was also a way for Cuneo to maintain connections, his influence with people in the intelligence community and people in the political realm as well. And I thought that was really interesting.
Cuneo played such an important role in the rise of James Bond, and there are a couple of ways in which he was fictionally incorporated into the Bond books, and also one of them I think was dedicated to him. But you mentioned Fleming and their relationship, but I'm curious about the story of how James Bond was created.
Well, with Ian Fleming, after World War II, Fleming had been fundamentally a reporter. He had worked as a writer and such. He had been a terrific spy, but he wanted a vehicle, a way to incorporate, like the way that writers do. They want to take their personal experiences and somehow turn it into their writings. And Fleming did that by creating a fictional character by the name of James Bond. And a lot of the experiences that Fleming had were incorporated into the characteristics of Bond, to the various different characters that Bond encountered in those novels. And one of those characters was named Ernie Curio, which was a play on Cuneo's name in one of the Bond books. The most interesting thing, as a practical matter, in the late 40s and the early 50s, uh, Fleming really didn't start writing his Bond books until about around 1952. So that was about 6 or 7 years after the war. Fleming, Cuneo, and another friend of Fleming's, Ivor Bryce was his name. They hung out together. They would spend summers at upstate New York, where Cuneo had a house, and so did Ivor Bryce. He had a really big, almost like mansion-like house. And so they would talk about it. They would spitball ideas and such. And so that was part of the kind of the brew that Fleming relied upon in creating James Bond. But Cuneo also provided legal counsel. The thing that was most interesting to me was with the novel Thunderball, which eventually Fleming dedicates that James Bond novel to Ernest Cuneo, my muse, is what he said in the dedication. And what I found in the papers that I reviewed was that Cuneo's papers and such, I found that Cuneo was involved in writing the first draft for the movie of Thunderball, which was one of the more popular movies in the James Bond franchises. And in fact, Fleming had recommended that Cuneo be the bad guy in Cuneo because he thought that his friend Ernie had a sinister face, and Cuneo wasn't too pleased with that, and of course he was not a player, not an actor in that James Bond movie. But it was just an indication of just how close their relationship was. They were as buddies. They were very different characters too. Fleming had lost what he called his great love, was killed during World War II. And that kind of broke his heart. And Fleming was kind of a cad. He was kind of James Bond-like in that regard. Cuneo, after World War II, really was looking for somebody to settle down with and have a family. And that's what he did.
And you mentioned in the book that Cuneo wrote his own book about the former New York mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, which actually played a role in in leading to the Broadway production of Fiorello, that great, I think, 1960 musical. But then, as you said, Cuneo wrote an autobiography, and he never published it. Just curious why he never published it.
Well, I think overall, both with Stevenson, who had been overseeing the Rockefeller spy operation, with Ian Fleming to some extent, and Cuneo, with people who had served in intelligence in the spy world, there was a code of honor not to talk about it. It was unprofessional to talk about it. If you were British, it was against the law to talk about it. And so people did not really address these things until many years after the war. For Ian Fleming, it was the fictional device of the James Bond novels, where I think a lot of that desire to have his experience recognized and played out, relived, is in those books. With Cuneo, I think it took him a long time to do this. It was interesting. The memoir that his son gave to me, there are portions of that in the papers that I found at the FDR library as well. Various different drafts and such, but he never really ever got it all together in that regard. Why he didn't, I think there were a variety of reasons, inertia to some extent, but he was a fairly industrious guy, so I don't think it was as much just being slow about it. I think there was that overall view that you shouldn't be talking about these matters, and if they did, they would be kept for generations in the future who could review these things. In other words, he wanted it on the record. It wasn't necessarily a key thing for him to have it published right away.
You do point out toward the end of the book that Cuneo may have had some second thoughts about being so much in the shadows. that he wanted to be recognized for his contributions.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting themes, something that I never really considered going into this book. But I realized Stevenson and Cuneo and Fleming, they all eventually wanted some recognition of this extraordinary experience of being spies during World War II. And Cuneo, the more he saw, in particular, there was a ABC miniseries called "A Man Called Intrepid," with David Niven playing the role of William Stevenson. And that occurred in the 1970s. And I think that kind of put the impetus in Cuneo to have his own experiences recognized. Bear in mind, you spend most of your life trying to be anonymous, deliberately anonymous, and then to have second thoughts about it and saying, hey, what about me? And so I think the purpose of writing that memoir was to get it all down on paper so that people, his children, but also his future generations, would recognize his contributions to this extraordinary time in American history.
So, when you reflect on your work and telling the story of Ernest Cuneo, curious if you have any thoughts about the relevancy of his life to the times we're living through right now.
Well, you could arguably say that Ernest Cuneo was a deep state figure. He had his hands in the media, he had his hands in politics and in government, and he also had his hands in espionage. And so I think he really is an excellent example of what we call today a deep state figure. And sometimes I think that phrase is bandied about, often without any real clear evidence. It's almost like it's a boogeyman, this a deep state figure. But Ernest Cuneo actually was, in many ways, a deep state figure during this time period of World War II. So the idea of telling his story and trying to report it all out, that was a big challenge for me. It was helped by having his memoir and the cooperation of his family. But that was certainly something that I think speaks to today's generation. The other thing is, my book is about the life and times of Ernest Cuneo, but it's also about the early history of American espionage. We see America go from we don't need a spy agency to having one only during World War II and then killing that agency, the OSS, and then coming back and saying, oh, we need the CIA. And when we talk about what's the necessity of espionage, some people like the Russians knew that they valued espionage greatly, and they were very advanced and sophisticated compared to the Americans. Somebody like Winston Churchill was a big believer in espionage. But the story of American espionage and the history of that is really the backdrop for my book, The Invisible Spy. It gives us an understanding of why it's so important today, why the CIA and other intelligence agencies, why the FBI, why we need people of character who run these, and why we need these agencies to be as effective as possible, because they provide the defense for Americans. They also help our leaders make the most intelligent decisions possible, most informed possible. And so I think my book is very much rooted in why we need really well operating spy agencies in this country.
That ambivalence that Americans have about spying is so fascinating, and an element of American history that came up in one of our early Now It's History newsletters, where I learned that at the CIA campus, there are statues to three Americans who were spies. Nathan Hale, who was a briefly incompetent spy, Harriet Tubman, who was interestingly a very effective spy, and Wild Bill Donovan. And probably there should be a statue to Ernest Cuneo.
Well, that building was built by Allen Dulles. When you get into the history of Allen Dulles, he essentially was being fired as the head of the CIA by John F. Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But he was allowed to kind of stay on for a few more months because Cuneo had overseen the building of the CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia, and so there was actually an event where even though they had their differences, Kennedy put a badge on, put a medal on Dulles' lapel. There's a picture of that. It's interesting to me. One of the most fascinating things of this book that I found had to do with Allen Dulles and with Ernest Cuneo. As they had worked together at Rockefeller Center, but when JFK was killed in 1963, President Johnson set up the Warren Commission to investigate the circumstances surrounding JFK's death. And one of the people that was put on that commission was Allen Dulles. And so in my research of Ernest Cuneo, I essentially stumbled upon some FBI documents in which apparently Dulles, while they were investigating JFK's death, was leaking information to Ernest Cuneo. Cuneo was planning to write something for he said, for the Saturday Evening Post. And he goes to the FBI, and actually Hoover writes a memo. And that's one of the memos that I cite in my book that I found, where Hoover says that Ernest Cuneo, who we like, who's been obviously an asset for us, he's come in, and apparently Allen Dulles is telling him what's going on with the Warren Commission, because essentially Allen Dulles wants to get his side out there. He wants to put his spin on what's going out there. And that Cuneo is preparing this article, and Hoover is pretty clearly horrified by this, although Hoover was Gerald Ford was leaking to Hoover during the Warren Commission. But the fact that Allen Dulles was apparently speaking to Cuneo, one pal to another pal, trying to get their side of the story out before the Warren Commission report was published, that was absolutely fascinating to me. It's kind of a sidebar to my overall focus of this book, which is in World War II in the early stages of the Cold War. But it just was an indication that old assets in espionage never die, that the friendships and the alliances between two spies, Allen Dulles and Ernest Cuneo, still existed. And that's one of the more amusing stories in my book.
And as long as you mentioned the Warren Commission, I have to ask you, what do you expect from the documents that President Trump has talked about releasing on the JFK assassination?
I think that most of those documents will be about covering your ass, if I can say such a phrase on your podcast here. That, in other words, I think the CIA and the FBI, particularly the CIA, I think they were aware of Oswald going to the Soviet embassies and the Cuban embassy, I believe it was, in Mexico City. And so the question is, like, why didn't you inform the FBI? That type of stuff. I think those documents are probably at the heart of what remains of these thousands of JFK documents. I think if we learn anything, it'll be more about that, and also the attempts by the CIA to kill Castro, which was kept from the Warren Commission. I think it'll be about that. I don't think there'll be any smoking gun per se. I think much of it will be about the insides of these agencies saying that we want to protect our sources, but actually what they really wanted to do was protect their ass bureaucratically. And needless to say, when the president gets shot, you can imagine what the consequences would have been. So I think that's behind what remains of these papers.
Well, Tom, I just want to congratulate you on a fascinating book and an excellent conversation. And best of luck in your future ventures.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's always enjoyable talking to you. And I did have you in mind. I know we had an early conversation while I was putting this book together, and I was thinking about readers just like you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Now It's History. You can stay up to date on all of our work at www.nowitshistory.com. Please sign up for regular updates. Our show relies on listener support, so please review us on your favorite podcast platform and spread the word. Today's episode of Now It's History was edited and produced by Jason Sanderson. We'll see you on the next page.